Story 1.
It was the middle of winter when I found myself in desperate need of an escape. My divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and the weight of it all had become unbearable. My girlfriend at the time, Christina, suggested we get away, find someplace quiet where I could clear my head. It didn't take long to find the perfect place, a modern yet cozy lake house in upstate New York. Isolated, surrounded by a dense forest with only a handful of empty vacation homes scattered along the shoreline. Exactly what I needed. The owner wouldn't be there, but he sent detailed instructions on where to find the key and basic house rules. Pretty standard. When we arrived, however, there was something unexpected waiting for us. A small package sat neatly on the doorstep. No return address. Just a handwritten note taped to the top. Enjoy your stay. Make sure to stay warm. The message itself seemed harmless, even thoughtful. Inside was a tiny box of matches. Christina laughed, joking about how quirky people could be in small towns. I tried to shake the unease creeping into my stomach and focused on the week ahead. For the next 2 days, everything was perfect. We took long hikes through the snow, drank hot cocoa by the fire, and soaked in the silence. The snowfall had been constant, light but steady, covering the landscape in an untouched white blanket. It felt peaceful, safe, until the third night. I woke up to a strange sound, faint, just barely audible over the wind and falling snow. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Low, mechanical, unnatural. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and glanced toward the window. What I saw sent a shiver through my body. A single snowmobile creeping across the frozen lake. There was no reason for someone to be out there at that hour. The snow was falling heavier now, visibility was low, and yet this person was moving slowly, cautiously, as if unsure of the ice beneath them. Then, without warning, they stopped completely and turned toward the house. I held my breath. The figure climbed off the snowmobile and started waving their arms wildly as if signaling for help. I squinted, trying to make out their features, but the darkness and snow made it impossible. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. Did they somehow know we were here? I woke Christina and told her what was happening. She sat up groggily, peering out the window. That's when we heard it. Muffled cries carried by the wind. A woman's voice pleading. "Please, my son, he's lost in the storm." My heart pounded. There was no question, I had to help. If there was a child out there in this weather, he wouldn't last long. I told Christina to stay inside and quickly bundled up before stepping onto the deck. The cold was brutal, biting through my layers. The woman stood on the ice, still shouting, her voice barely carrying over the wind. As I moved closer, I started to make out more details. She was wrapped in a thick fur coat, her hair pulled back into a tight braid. Her face was partially obscured by a scarf, but something about her posture, something subtle, felt wrong. I pushed the thought aside. A child was out there. That was all that mattered. But then she spoke again, and I froze. "Did you bring the matches?" The words made no sense at first. Then realization crashed over me like ice water. The matches, the package, the note. I took a step back. Before I could react, she reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. Wallet? Phone. Now. I didn't hesitate. My hands trembled as I handed them over. She snatched them quickly, then climbed back onto the snowmobile. Without another word, she sped off into the whiteout, disappearing into the storm. For a moment, I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body locked in place. Then I turned and ran back to the house, shouting for Christina to call the police. She was already on the phone when I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me. My heart hammered against my ribs. My skin crawled with the feeling that we had been watched from the very beginning. The police arrived about an hour later, but by then, the fresh snowfall had covered any tracks she might have left. They searched the area, eventually finding an old boat ramp on the far side of the lake. Their best guess? She had used it to access the ice. But that was it. No snowmobile, no signs of her. Nothing. The Airbnb host seemed genuinely shocked when I told him what had happened. He even refunded the entire trip, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right. How had she known we were there? Why go through all of that for a simple robbery? And the matches? Why did she leave them for us? I'll never have the answers, but I do know one thing. I came to that lake house looking for peace. Instead, I left knowing that someone, somewhere, had been expecting me all along.
Story 2.
Growing up, my family owned a small lake house in northern Michigan. It was nothing fancy, just a modest cabin passed down through generations. It had always been my favorite place in the world, a retreat from the chaos of everyday life. I had spent every summer there as a kid, fishing off the dock, roasting marshmallows, and swimming in the lake until my skin wrinkled. But there was one summer, the last one I ever spent there, that changed the way I looked at that house forever. It was the summer after my freshman year of college. My parents had been struggling financially, and they had decided to put the cabin up for sale. I didn't want to let it go without one last trip, so I convinced my two closest friends, Adam and Jake, to join me for a weekend at the lake house. One final farewell. The first night was perfect. We made steaks on the grill, drank a few beers, and reminisced about childhood summers. The air was warm, the lake calm, and the sky was so clear you could see every star. It felt like nothing had changed, but that feeling wouldn't last. At around 1 a.m., we were sitting on the porch when we heard something from across the lake. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was slow, deliberate, almost like someone was knocking on wood. Tap, tap, tap. We stopped talking and listened. The sound echoed over the water, distant yet distinct. Probably just a branch in the water, Jake said, brushing it off. But something about it felt off. It wasn't random. It was too steady, too intentional. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, and eventually we called it a night and went inside. At around 3 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Except this time, it was closer. Much closer. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from across the lake anymore. It was coming from the dock. I hesitated for a moment before pulling back the curtain. The moon cast a silver glow over the water, illuminating the wooden dock that stretched out into the lake. And that's when I saw it. A figure. Standing at the very end of the dock, facing the house. I couldn't make out any features, just the dark outline of a person. They stood completely still, arms at their sides, staring toward the cabin. A cold chill ran through my body. I blinked, hoping my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, they were still there. I scrambled out of bed and shook Adam awake. "There's someone outside," I whispered. He groggily sat up and followed me to the window. But when we looked back out, the dock was empty. "There was someone there," I insisted. Adam yawned. "Maybe it was a shadow or something." "Go back to sleep, man." But I couldn't. I stayed awake, listening, waiting. And just when I started to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it, I heard something new. The front porch steps creaking. I held my breath. Then, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. Knock, knock, knock. I shot out of bed and grabbed the nearest object, a fireplace poker. I wasn't about to open the door, but I wasn't going to sit there defenseless either. Jake woke up from the noise and whispered, "What the hell is that?" We all stood frozen in place, waiting for another knock, but it never came. After what felt like an eternity, I finally mustered the courage to approach the door and peek through the peephole. Nothing. I unlocked the door and swung it open, poker raised. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. There were no footprints in the dirt. No signs that anyone had been there. Jake and Adam were rattled, but they tried to play it off. Maybe it was an animal, Adam said, or the wood settling. But I knew what I saw. We locked every door and window, keeping the lights on until morning. As soon as the sun came up, I walked out to the dock, half expecting to find footprints. There was nothing, but the eerie feeling hadn't left. We packed up and left that day. I never went back to the lake house again. My parents sold it a few months later, and I never asked who bought it. I didn't want to know, because whoever or whatever I saw that night, I had the sinking feeling that they were still watching.
Story 3.
My uncle owned a lake house deep in the woods of Minnesota. It wasn't anything luxurious, just an old 2-bedroom cabin with a dock that stretched out onto a vast, silent lake. He rarely used it, so when he offered me and my girlfriend Lisa a chance to stay there for a long weekend, we jumped at the opportunity. A few days away from the noise of the city sounded perfect. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The lake was still, the only sound coming from the gentle lapping of water against the dock. It was peaceful, almost eerily so. As we unpacked, my uncle gave me a quick rundown of the place. "There's no Wi-Fi out here and cell service is spotty," he warned. "But that's part of the charm, right?" Lisa and I didn't mind. In fact, that was part of why we wanted to come, to disconnect, unwind. He also mentioned something strange before leaving. "If you hear anything weird at night, just ignore it. Sound carries differently out here. The lake plays tricks on you." I laughed, thinking he was just trying to spook us. If only I had taken his words more seriously. That first night, after grilling burgers and drinking by the fire, we decided to take a walk down to the dock. The sky was pitch black, save for the stars reflecting on the water's surface. Everything was completely silent. Then we heard it. A splash. Not the kind of fish makes, but something much larger. Lisa gripped my arm. "What was that?" I shined my flashlight over the lake, but all I could see was endless black water. "Probably a beaver," I said, trying to sound casual. But something about it didn't feel right. The water was too calm, too undisturbed. Whatever made that noise had disappeared completely. We went inside, locked the doors, and settled into bed. I expected to sleep peacefully. Instead, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the dock. Slow, deliberate, wood creaking under weight. Lisa stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I held my breath, listening. The steps were heavy, unhurried. They stopped right at the end of the dock. Then, silence. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the window, peering through the curtain. My stomach tightened. There was a figure standing there, barely visible against the darkness. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. I whispered to Lisa, "Stay here." She grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy?" I didn't answer. My heart was hammering as I slowly unlocked the front door and stepped onto the porch. The night air was freezing. I raised the flashlight, aiming it at the dock. Nobody was there. The dock was empty. The water was still. But I knew what I had seen. I locked the door and tried to shake the uneasy feeling, telling myself my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a shadow? Maybe it was just the way the light hit the water. That's what I told myself. The next day, we tried to enjoy the trip. We hiked through the forest, made lunch on the deck, and even took a canoe out onto the lake. But something felt off. The woods felt too quiet. The air felt too thick. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, the real terror began. We were sitting inside playing cards by candlelight when we heard something outside. Not footsteps this time, scraping, like something dragging across wood. I looked at Lisa. She had gone pale. Slowly, I stood up and moved toward the window. My hands were clammy as I peeled back the curtain. There on the dock was a trail of wet footprints, leading from the edge of the water straight to our cabin. My blood ran cold. Lisa whispered, "Someone's out there." I grabbed the fireplace poker and moved toward the door. Just as I reached for the handle, 3 heavy knocks echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. We both froze. The knocks were slow, deliberate, as if whoever was out there knew we were inside and was waiting. Then a voice, low, hoarse. "Let me in." Lisa clutched my arm, shaking her head furiously. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body was frozen in place. The silence stretched on. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the presence outside vanished. We didn't sleep that night. We sat huddled together, waiting for the sun to rise. When daylight finally came, I went outside to check. The wet footprints were gone. The dock was dry. It was like nothing had happened. But then I saw them. Handprints. Faint, wet handprints smeared across our cabin window. We packed up and left within the hour. I never told my uncle exactly what happened, just that we had to cut the trip short. He didn't seem surprised. He only nodded as if he already knew. Lisa and I never spoke about that night again, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. The knocking, the voice. "Let me in."